to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Thiard. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast. This time we're very lucky to have two guests, Jon Stokes and Jan Hall. Jon is a clinical psychologist, a psychotherapist, and a leadership coach. He teaches management at Said Business School in Oxford. And Jon and Jan published in February this year an extraordinary book called Changing Gear, Creating the Life You Want After a Full-On Career. And that can be bought on the book's website at www.changing-gear.com. Jon and Jan suggest an 8-step process to manage this transition. And I would love for Jan to take a moment to just introduce herself and tell us her angle on why they're both here. And then we'll get into some questions. Jan.
Hello, everyone. So a little tiny bit about me, which when you talk about the disrupted career, I think I've had a continually disrupted career, but mainly at my own instigation. So I started life working for a big corporate as the brand manager on what was then Dulux, and had the joy of being able to launch a whole new brand under that. So I really got to understand the whole customer piece and loved that. But then I left and set up a business that was involved in branding because I'd seen how branding could get to the heart of businesses. And when I'd been at Oxford, I wanted to go into business because I wanted to be at the heart of how things move forward. So I've always had this thing about being at the heart of how it moves forward. So I then set up a business, we built that, sold it, and then had the inevitable earnout. And during that time, we shifted the focus of the business from branding around products and services to companies. And I work very closely with a lot of CEOs of big companies, helping them think through their company identity, which is really where, in a sense, the rest of my career has sort of hung in a way. And as a result of building a business that became successful, I was in my late 20s when I had my first non-executive directorship because I was the CEO of a business. And in those days, there weren't many, and people kind of didn't really care what it was and how old you were if you were a female CEO and you could string a sentence together, which I broadly could. So I got to know the business leaders in the UK at a very young age because I then got invited onto government committees and things and did work with government. So I then, once I'd finished doing that with that business, I then went to run the European side of a PLC. I'd always wanted to be the executive director of a PLC. And actually, I wanted to be the CEO of a PLC. But I then realized that if I was going to have a baby, I needed to get on with it. And having got pregnant, decided actually I didn't want to be in the job that I'd done. I was traveling around Europe the whole time, and I didn't want to do that if I had a baby. So I then rethought what I would do. And the only thing that came up that ticked all my boxes, which I didn't really want to do, was to become a headhunter. And so I did that, but I was incredibly lucky because it turned out to be a wonderful thing to do. And it brought together everything I was interested in, which was people, companies, and leadership. And I very quickly, partly because I knew them, but partly because I'd had quite a lot of expertise of how do companies at the top work. So most of my headhunting career was CEOs and chairmen. And I did that for 20 years. And after about 8 years working with Spencer Stuart, who are obviously one of the great global search firms, I kind of the itch to do it differently appeared. And I set up a business called JCA. And then we sold that after another 10 years, not really intentionally, but it was just the right way for everybody to grow. And that then caused me to, after we'd sold it, to then leave. And I then was sitting in my garden with Jon, and he and I were discussing the fact that our lives were moving on and how come both of us who really understood how leaders worked and how transitions happened when people stopped being the leaders of things that they loved and that to a large extent defined them. Kind of how come we understood all of that, but we were struggling with it? And that led us to say, this is harder than we thought from the outside when you've got to do it for yourself inside. So the cobbler's children, we kind of we weren't wearing our shoes. And as a result of a few more conversations, decided to write a book about it.
Wonderful. Jan, I knew I was going to get a wonderfully disrupted career story out of you. That's why I made you do it live online rather than trying to do a bumbling version of it myself. Thank you so much. And I think we've probably been living parallel lives, you and me, and we've got probably a lot more to talk about offline as well. But thank you so much. Jon, let's come back to you and talk about how your particular career unfolded. You came from a very different background from Jan or from me or Antoine. You were trained as a psychologist, and we'd love to know what it was that attracted you to this field and how you've played that out in your own particular story over time.
Well, I usually say it all began when I was 8 years old and was sent to a prep school, a boarding prep school, and which I thought was fairly appalling for myself and for others, although other boys seemed to think it was a wonderful thing. I didn't. So I was quite perplexed by all this, and also perplexed by why on earth my parents thought this, what I thought dreadful establishment was really for. So it was a puzzle. And the way I solved that puzzle was to become an organizational psychologist, you could say, at the age of 8, trying to figure all this out, and a psychologist of human beings. And that led on to me studying psychology at university, and then as a clinical psychologist in the health service for 20 years. I worked at the Tavistock Clinic, which is a well-known centre for psychotherapy in the world, and became chair of the adult department there, which got me interested in leadership and how to influence and persuade professionals who are a fairly difficult bunch to influence. Got me thinking about that, and became interested therefore in leadership and management. And having done that for 5 years, I set up a consultancy service within the health service, working with leaders in commercial industry. So the idea was to generate some income for the health service. And what then became known as coaching, although we didn't call it that at the time, we just called it organization consulting. And that's my interest, really, is helping people understand themselves in their context, not just understand themselves, although I had a clinical career, trained as a psychotherapist in psychoanalysis and so forth. And so I ran that for 5 years, and then decided that, partly because I had a young family by that point, that I wanted to earn a bit more money, and that moving out into the private sector was a way to do that, and set up a consulting firm, leadership consulting firm with my colleague Richard Jolly. So we're called Stokes Jolly, and we've worked with leaders in all sorts of different ways. I primarily work one-to-one with the heads of organizations, a lot of them whom come from professional services.
Fantastic. And how do you expect your career to continue to evolve from here on in? You're doing what you're doing. You've written your book. Your book is all about second stages and then third stages, the transition on to the rest of your life. What, if you had a crystal ball, what would you be doing in another 10 or 15 years' time?
So I'll answer that. I thought Jan was perhaps going to answer that. So give me time to think. Well, in 10 or 15 years, that does seem quite a stretch, and you'd think I would have a good answer to that. But I've moved over to working part-time, and I've moved over to doing far more pro bono work, again, consulting with leaders. I have a part-time appointment at Saïd Business School at Oxford. So I'd probably still be doing some of that, although I am gradually shifting my time over to other activities. So I've got an interest in the theatre, and I want to spend more time thinking about that. I have an idea of writing a play, which I dare say, I'm not saying it'll be put on anywhere, but just the pleasure of writing it. So one of the things this book has helped me realize is that I actually rather enjoy writing, and it's a new hobby in a way for me. So that I imagine myself doing that. I imagine myself doing reading in the garden, like Cicero, who recommends that for one's older years, and reading all the books that I didn't have time to read. So I'm sort of working my way through various classics in English literature and also philosophy, which is another kind of hobby. So they're all things, and what I would like to be doing, I suppose, is doing things I enjoy doing. I think that's the great advantage of the third stage of life, is you can think, well, what do you actually enjoy? And how can you spend time doing that rather than things you don't enjoy?
So important. That's so important. So let's go back to this conversation that you and Jan had in the garden a few years ago when you started thinking about writing this book, Changing Gear. You know, you've talked about feeling like cobbler's children, but what was it that you found so compelling that you actually agreed to go through what we all know is a difficult but perhaps rewarding process of writing a book? You wanted to write about this topic of transition. You were thinking about this third stage, but what was it that made you eventually decide this is worth writing about?
I think both of us, from our different perspectives, knew when we talked about it, we realized we actually both knew a lot about it. And if we combined our experience, so the bit I didn't say earlier is there was a point at which I also became a coach. And so we had the coaching piece in common, although when I met, because he was involved in helping me to develop my coaching skills. So we bring a really broad set of expertise to it, both from a kind of really deep psychological perspective, but also from seeing lots of different leaders in process. And part of being a headhunter actually is, although you are paid to help companies appoint their new chairman or CEOs in my case, you spend a lot of your time meeting people and talking to them about their transitions, because that's part of the deal. And so it's kind of it's an unpaid part of it, but I always loved that piece of it. And so when I really looked at it, we thought, well, we really understand this. And the other thing was something which Jon understood deeply, and I think I kind of understood, but not as deeply as I do now. And we ended up describing it in the book as the elephant and the rider, which is the difference between your, in effect, conscious brain and your unconscious brain. And although we didn't put it in the book, it started with a conversation where we were trying to say, well, what is your brain up to in this transition? Because you want your brain, the rational you has decided to do something. And then your brain is taking you all over the place to places you don't want to go. And we ended up talking about the idea of the brain as an organ in your body. So we have our heart, our lungs, our kidneys, our liver, and our brains. It's an organ. Other four organs, we completely accept that they are part of keeping our body in, as a scientist would say, stasis. I did a biochemistry degree originally, but in stasis. So the organs are designed to function without us noticing them and to keep our environment constant. And that realization that actually what was going on is that if you draw the distinction, and million philosophers and scientists would say it's a terrible distinction, but for the purposes of this, if you say your mind is one thing, but your brain as an organ is another, then your mind is saying, I want to now stop doing this or do less of this and do more of that, or I want to change, or I want to change, okay, there's no choice, so I'm going to head in this direction. But your brain as an organ, your body is going, we know how to do the thing we've been doing for a long time, and it's not comfortable not doing that. So we're going to keep taking you back to that and say to you, this is a bad idea, keep the original stasis. And that, I think, is at the heart of all transitions. But this transition from, in effect, your second life, as the Hindus call it, which is the kind of homemaker and family maker and career maker, or work maker, whatever it is, to a thing where you have more choice, even if it's not your choice to go there. Once you get there, you do have more choice. That's really hard. And it's a new thing in history that period now is often 20, 30 years for people, and certainly 15 to 20, even if you're unlucky and you don't live a very long life. And that is new. So although, life expectancy has been creeping up for a while, it's really in the last 5 to 10 years where you have this new gift of a third life. And so both Jon and I think about, we're both doing more pro bono work. So we both have a view that actually in your third life, it's a good thing to be able to focus a bit more on what you think your purpose should be and give back. So how do you struggle into that and cope at the point at which your brain is going, no, I don't want to go there?
Okay, that's a lovely explanation of why you wrote the book. I'm not terribly sure I'm going to needle you too much on the exact process of writing the book, but I'm sure we can smile and empathize with each other about the process of writing a book, especially jointly. It brings goods and bads, but we may come back to that. But at this point, I'd really like to dig into a particular aspect that you raise in the introduction of the book, which is this sense of unease and uncertainty and anxiety that people are experiencing, especially after their 50s. Part of that is, as you've just said, it's a long period after your 50s. We're given this roughly 100-year life, according to Linda Hall, and reality and statistics. So what is it that is creating this unease and uncertainty and anxiety, and why has it become so critical?
Well, I think, as Jan's explained, one of the things is one simply probably doesn't know what one's going to do, and that's just a cause of uncertainty and anxiety. At the age of 60, you may have something like 50% of your working life still to go, if you're really lucky. Certainly you've got 20 years, and that would be a third of your working life. So there's all this space, and then what on earth am I going to do to fill it with? And people often haven't given this much thought, and indeed, sometimes it's quite difficult to give it thought until the actual moment itself. And so one of the things I recommend to people is, if you can't think about it in advance, which is obviously preferable in some ways, but if you can't, never mind, wait until you've left the organization, for example, and give yourself a year to spend the first 6 months doing things you enjoy doing, to discover again, or perhaps anew, things that you really enjoy and what give you a sense of purpose and meaning and pleasure in life. So one needs quite a bit of time to do that. You can do it beforehand, and some people have quite clear ideas of what they want to do, and some people are very clear they want to have a much more restful time, but other people want to be busy. So it's a matter of that. And of course, one has to say it's also a question of realizing that one's strengths will diminish, that there is an end point at some point, and that is a fairly terrifying prospect to many of us in terms of the uncertainty that brings. So there's a lot to work on. Indeed.
So in your book, you present a wonderful series of case studies of people who've been through this kind of upheaval, some of them, of course, a lot more successfully than others. Could you share with us one or even several examples of these individual stories? Give us some feeling for the patterns and themes that emerge. Obviously, the stories must all be different, but we can only imagine that there are indeed common themes that the audience would very much like to hear about. And as I listen to you now, and as we listen to you later, both of us, Antoine and I, as being over 50 in ourselves, we know we should be listening very carefully and encouraging our listeners to do exactly the same. So what would you like to share?
I think that probably the best way to kick off, I think, is around the common themes rather than the individual stories, because they're kind of on themselves quite personal. But the themes are around either somebody themselves feeling that they need to change, or they want to change, or that they kind of have that. Then sometimes, particularly if people travel a lot, that they're tired, and they're kind of at that point where somewhere in their heads they're going, I think I want to do things differently. And sometimes, actually, Jon works a lot in professional services. They really don't, but their firms have time limits. And so they're kind of, like the sort of cartoon character not wanting to go in a tunnel, holding their hands against the tunnel entrance, going, no, I don't want to go in there. So one of the common things is that, that feeling of lack of balance, which is the way Jon described it when we were talking about this in the early days. And it's a brilliant thing, because if you've been really happy in your job, you don't have to have been running a big organization. You might have been doing something. I mean, my mother, worked with children who were disadvantaged, and she adored that. She wasn't a megastar, but actually she loved it. So if you've done a job which you feel defines you because it consumes you in a good way, then when you come to leave that, it's a scary thing. And how you leave it, you don't know, because you have been doing it for quite a long time. So that lack of balance and the sense in your head that it's coming, either because it's your wish, but kind of this kind of slightly difficult to define wish, or somebody else's wish. So feeling unbalanced, I think, is really common in all of this. And then the other feeling that's really common is denial, which is, and particularly if you have been a kind of big leader, or a sort of leader where you've been full on and this defined you. John and I did a session recently for headmasters, and they did call them headmasters, didn't they, John? But actually for head teachers. So, and if you run a school, that's a really good example of where you are likely to be A, consumed by it, and B, defined by it. And it could be a school, but it's kind of a big chunk of your life. So that lack of balance. And then actually, instead of saying, let's embrace it and let my brain go with it, what a lot of people do is kind of fight going. And sometimes they do it consciously, and sometimes they do it really unconsciously. So one of the things I saw working with CEOs over the years, and chairmen too sometimes, is that real sense of, I don't want to let go. So the last CEO, last chairmanship, and it's true for lots of things, they're holding on like mad because they don't know what's going to come the other side of it. And I think the feeling is one that you're holding onto a cliff edge and you're frightened, how you drop. So there's the kind of lack of balance. And then there's, at its worst, terror, but certainly fear of some level about where it goes. So those two are really common. And then I think there's the place where your head is just all over the place and you're kind of used to being in control of your head and you can't be. So letting that happen, so you give yourself time to think. And John talked earlier about a year, and it's not unrealistic for for you to kind of need time to do that piece of, where do I want to be? And it changes as you think about it and as you settle into new routines, either at home or somewhere else. Just allowing that to happen and watching yourself doing it is a really important part of that. So one of the themes is owning it. Once you've kind of got unbalanced, you've denied it, then you've got to own it. And then owning it means you can then start to explore, okay, well, what do I do with it? And then having got to, well, what are the options? You then have to play, I think, with some of them. Sometimes you might want to do things you can't do. And so you hit some closed doors and that's really uncomfortable. And other times you actually realize it isn't particularly what you want to do. And there's something else that's more important to you, or you want a mix of different things. So there's that. The next bit of it is the exploration bit. And that's probably a point to stop. But those are the common bits, I would say. John?
Fantastic.
If I give an example, working with a professional well called Max, who was coming up to the end of his career in the firm. And as Jan has said, particularly law firms with whom I do a lot of work, there is actually more or less a set date by which people have to leave.
Indeed.
And this has to do with the remuneration system of British law firms. It's different in US law firms. So as he was coming up to this, one of the things we worked with was one of the exercises in the book, which is called What Do You Do and Why Do You Do It? Fairly obvious questions. And then how do you do those things? So it's a series of questions, essentially with those elements to them, which you work your way through in a series of steps to get to really the fundamental purpose of what you do at work and why you do it. And in his case, it was solving people's problems and problems that were important to them. And why he did it, he was somewhat surprised to find his answer was to reduce the chaos in the world. So this had been quite an unconscious element, largely unconscious element in his desire for his work. So if we're very committed to our work and have put a lot of energy into it, it's usually because it's meeting quite a deep purpose of some kind, as well as the more superficial purposes.
Sure.
Obviously. And reflecting on this and thinking about this, he came to the conclusion that one of the things he wanted to do in his third life was to be a prison visitor. He was a lawyer, and therefore he had certain skills which he could bring to bear on helping people coming towards the end of their time in prison. And also it was his commitment to society in a sense, because if prisoners can go out and not commit more crimes, which of course is unfortunately often the pattern, then that's improving the world at the same time. So that's just a little example. What I would also say about that example is that actually the organization found it quite difficult. Also, it's not just individuals who find it difficult, organizations find it difficult. Human beings, when faced with separation, can dig their heels in various ways or go into denial in various ways. And the organization, and this is not an untypical example, having agreed a date, which I think was about 9 months ahead, then came back to him a couple of weeks later and said, would you mind terribly if you left a bit sooner than that? Because actually there was somebody who needed his job. And so there can be ambivalence on both sides. Most people want to get separations done and tend to do it too rapidly, which is not necessarily to the advantage of either side.
Although in my experience, too many people try and extend the separation too long. And so there's a sweet spot in the middle. I didn't say, actually, I realise in my kind of one of the things is, by and large, the piece I didn't say, which I should have said, is people end up in a pretty good place. So it's just a question of how messy it is to get to the good place. And part of what our book is about is trying to help, in a sense, manage and minimise the mess. So, the dilemma is it's not only messy in your own head, but whilst you're being a bit messy, if you're not careful, you make it messy for the people around you. And so thinking through how you do it and how everyone around you plays their part in it is really important. But by and large, people do find their way forward. It just takes longer than they think to get to that place.
Indeed. I love the simplicity of managing and minimizing the mess. It's a very simple one. Now, in your book, you actually use some interesting psychological frameworks to help readers think about how they're making their transition. You've alluded to the rider and the elephant already, but some of the concepts that you have are rather intriguing. Would you like to give us any more examples of the particular psychological thinking and angles that you've used, and maybe elaborate on one of the concepts that you've played with?
Well, I'll pick the paradoxes of power. It's one of the chapters in the book, and in part the book is aimed at people because it has a subtitle, what you're going to do with your life after a full-on career. Many of the people will have had quite senior positions and spent a good deal of time and energy doing that, and hence quite a lot of their attachments in life are to work colleagues, are to the act of work itself, and have achieved a degree of success in all of that. And as a result, the lack of that, the prospective lack of all of that, can quite easily be compared to a sense of failure, or felt as a sense of potential failure, because it's the opposite of achievement. It's just the brain kind of thinks in those terms, I think. And therefore, people struggle quite a lot with that. And one of the paradoxes of power is that your sense of validation, your sense of success has come from your work. So it may seem without that, what on earth am I? Who am I? And what on earth am I going to be doing? Which makes it harder for people who've put so much energy into work to make this transition. Other people may have kept their life going in a more reasonable balance, let's say, and it's my experience that women senior executives find it a little bit easier, at least, than the men, because they've often had careers which have moved around between motherhood and moved around in organizations and so forth. It just is the case, and therefore they're much more comfortable with the idea of transition. They don't expect things to continue the same throughout their career, haven't had that experience. And also they've kept going their family and friendship relationships in a way that, sadly, perhaps many men haven't done. And so it's an easier prospect in some ways for women, in my experience.
And I think one of the things that we talk about is the need to be needed. And it might be needed to, as John talked about his coachee earlier, the need to be needed to create order out of chaos. It might be the need to be needed to help others. It might be the need to be needed to tell other people what to do. But that need to be needed is very powerful in human beings. And so the paradoxes of power are all about how leaders really manage their different needs. And I think, for many people, John was talking about the prison visitor earlier, and actually a friend of mine thought they would be a prison visitor as well, and went for a day in a prison. And when they came out to be a volunteer, when they came out at the end, they'd written a list of things that could be done better. And the person who was organising the day of prison visits went, that's very sweet of you, but we don't need our volunteers to tell us what to do. We need our volunteers to do what we ask them to do.
Indeed, that old concept of help being the thing you want to do or the thing the other person needs. Yes.
And so I would say that's another of the psychological issues, is how do you let go for a period of your need for control or for validation or being right. So the Paradox of Power, if you read the book, they are all about that need to, in some sense, define your environment and define yourself in that environment. And letting go of that is so powerful, but your back thing is it's very scary.
Now let's go to some of the practical aspects of the book. You offer an 8-step transition process to help people find their new selves. And much of that resonates with the 4 E's model of career transition that Antoine and I developed, which is, half as complex, but just as challenging. We use the 4 E's: explore, experiment, engage, and expand. Can you take our listeners through your 8-step process and illustrate along the way as you see fit?
Well, what we've done is to break them in. We've taken the 8 but slightly broken them into 4. So the first 2 talked about already. They are that sense of losing your balance, of going into, again, John's original kind of description of it, which I thought was brilliant, is you go into a room which says, change is now going to happen. And it doesn't matter whether you've walked in or you've been pushed in. Once that door is closed, then you have to take stock. And so that first stage is accepting a loss of balance and taking stock of where you are. And that's not straightforward. And then as part of taking stock is really kind of looking around you. And John was talking about the exercise he did with his colleague, where he kind of worked out what his purpose had been at work. And actually, there's quite a lot of exercises in the book about how do you take stock of what has mattered to me, why has it made me feel good, what do I want to change about what I used to do and what I want to do going forward. So that period of just turning a spotlight on yourself, because often as a leader, although you're too much about you as the leader, actually your attention and your focus consciously is on everything else. Even unconsciously it might be about you, but otherwise it's about everything else. So being able to turn the spotlight on you in a way that isn't necessarily critical but is objective, and then being kind to yourself, because I think when you do turn that spotlight onto yourself, you can end up being quite shocked by some of the ways that you got into behaving. And if your young self had looked at your older self, it might not think that was a great way to have ended up. But actually, that's true for many people. So that first stage is taking stock, but also teaching yourself to give yourself a break and be kind and use that knowledge. Then the second stage is looking at what other things you can do and experimenting and trialing without thinking I'm definitely going to do this. Because I think if you're used to being in control, what people try and want to do is leap to the next thing. And the career advice you get from headhunters is, don't take the first thing you're offered. That's really being able to look at stuff, play with it a bit before you are really trying to settle, and avoid the urge to feel that you've got to settle on something. So there's that looking and experimenting and working out where you want to go. Then the next stage we come to, actually, it isn't quite a stage in the sense that it's about letting go. And it's really, in the book, it kind of almost follows the grief cycle. There's a kind of shock, denial, anger, acceptance, moving on.
Yeah.
That happens. Sometimes it starts right at the beginning, but sometimes it takes a while. And John's point about both organizations and people learning to let go, but also how they let go. So your organization might not want you to be going either, and that's quite hard. So you'll have old colleagues coming to you, I wish you were still here. So that it can be quite a prolonged period where you are going through that grief cycle, because losing that sense of your identity that's been so important in your life is massive. And again, trying to be able to sort of watch yourself going through it. There's that kind of thing of different two brains here. It's the brain which is doing it, but it's a brain that's also watching yourself doing it. And it's that brain needs to be kind and supportive, not critical. And if you've got a critical other half of your brain, trying hard not to let it run, because that makes everything much worse. And I think, there are people who really struggle, and it's probably partly because somewhere deep down, they know that they're not in the place they wanted to be. And instead of supporting themselves to get to a new place, they're kind of beating themselves up a bit about being there. Not a very psychological term, John, but then there is starting to be doing the new things, accepting again in the doing the new, it's not going to be perfect. But you are, as we said in the book, you're swimming, you feel like you're swimming in new waters. And the swimming was an important analogy because it's sort of holding you up and supporting you. And unless you really hate the water or it's too cold, unless you are now a wild swimmer, then that swimming in new waters feels comfortable, it feels lighter, it feels easier, freer. So the swimming analogy, I think, is a really good one. And enjoying that. And then the last stage, which is crucially important, is the assessing and regularly coming back and saying, well, okay, now, and where do I want to go? Because if you go through that process, it might be the first time that you've consciously done a major transition. And obviously, there are lessons that you can learn from transitions in the past, but actually making sure that you take those lessons and use them as you go forward, because life is iterative and our feelings aren't constant. And so being able to keep on managing that iteration around how do I move forward, where am I going to be? And both John would say in the last few years since we started to think about the book and wrote it, we've both iterated quite a lot. And so there is an 8-step process, but it's not an 8-step process that starts and finishes. It's a process it's a sort of circular process.
Absolutely.
And keep going through. Not the very early stages of it, but the sort of exploring, experimenting, feeling free in a new environment, and then reshaping it, really important. And learning about, a big part of that third life is being a bit more in touch with who you are.
Indeed.
It's helpful for people to realize that when they're being self-critical, it's also a way of hanging on to something. I mean, one knows one's self-criticisms and one repeats them, and we all do it. No matter how much psychotherapy we've had, we still do it. And as Jan said, we could be kinder to ourselves, but also to recognize that it is a kind of sense of control because it's something you're familiar with. It's like an old overcoat that you put on, perhaps rather grubby overcoat, but anyway, you put it on and you wander around in it in a sad state, like Eeyore or something or other. But the whole point, rather like Eeyore, I mean, part of the joke about Eeyore is she likes being like that. And that's part of the attraction of self-critical thoughts is that they're familiar. They're a familiar pair of clothes, and they're a retreat or a denial of novelty and newness. And maybe that can help people sometimes to realize that it's staying with the familiar.
I didn't think we'd be talking about Eeyore this morning, but I'm so glad we did. It's a lovely analogy. Thank you. I think it's absolutely true how easy it is to hide behind one's complaints about oneself, one situation as an excuse not to move forward. So it was very, very interesting to think about Eeyore in that context. Let's move right back up to right now and ask both of you quite simply, what's your big dream with Changing Gear? You've written a book, you work with individuals and organizations, maybe even society one day. What sort of impact would be the dream impact for you to have with this work?
Yeah, well, if I take that point about society, which we haven't spoken about so much, and our book isn't centrally about that, though we do refer to that, but your listeners may be familiar, there's quite a number of books come out recently, The 100-Year Life, which I think you referred to earlier, and by Andrew Scott and Linda Grattan.
Indeed.
And then there is Extra Time by a colleague of ours, Camilla Cavendish. And so there's quite a looking at how society adapts to this new fact that people, I mean, in fact, it's been gradually increasing over time, but it seems to be much more prominent these days, the realization of this extra time that we have and how society adapts to that and what to do with potential contributions to society and to the workforce. So I think one of our hopes is that this is a thing. We're not the first people to say it, but we want to underline it. It is a thing, but it is a thing which both society and individuals and communities and families need to get more used to. And the whole business of transitioning, we're probably familiar with. You go to your first school. People don't expect children to immediately adapt to their new school, or when they go to university, or indeed their first job. We understand that human beings have to go through a phase of transition. I think society more broadly hasn't really taken on board this moving to the third stage, which means that it's a sort of undiscussed topic. And I think one of our primary aims is that this just have more discussion. And also, I think we both personally hope that it's a book that will increase people's happiness. A big ask, but nevertheless, it's true that the evidence on happiness is that the decade of the 70s is actually statistically the happiest decade in people's lives. People aren't aware of that, but that is true. And I think it's because some of the pressures have been taken off, and because people feel a bit freer to be themselves. It's actually a happy time for people, and not many people are aware of that.
I would add something that's not remotely in the book, but is increasingly in my mind, is that because we are in a place where the third life should potentially be about giving back, what you're doing in a sense is giving back to build society for today and tomorrow, not for yesterday. And I think that there is a huge shift in attitudes and the way in which the millennials and Gen Z, so people under 40, see the world. And particularly the Gen Zers who are under 25. And it's really quite alien in many ways to those of us who are over 50. And actually taking the time to understand how they think, what they care about, what their values are, how that is all moving forward, I think is the responsibility of everybody over 50. But the people who are listening to this and who are reading our book are smart, intelligent people who should have the capacity to understand. So my big plea was for people to be both curious but also open, because it's so, I certainly find myself and my friends and my, the people I work with at work, there is a sense in which people feeling disgruntled about how the world is. There's lots to feel unhappy about at the moment, but actually we do have the opportunity to really learn about how we can be of value to that generation who are coming through. And I don't think we're doing a good enough job about that at the moment.
I think that's absolutely true. And a client of mine was thinking very deeply about this the other day, and then taking it to a somewhat banal level in some respects, but I thought it was fascinating. She decided to watch Squid Game on Netflix, mainly because she felt she should be watching it because it's what the Gen Zers are watching, and the attitudes and behaviors and values that they have are quite graphically expressed in the series, and that there was a lot to learn. So she went off and watched something that she didn't find remotely comfortable, but she's head of people in a large organization, and she wanted to understand, what are my children thinking, and what are all the graduates and other young people coming in to this organization wanting, needing, feeling, thinking, sensing. I want to get that. And I thought that was a wonderful display of exactly the sort of empathy that you're suggesting we all need to develop, instead of just grumbling about them like grumpy old people.
Yeah, and we've all learned in lockdown to share our favourite Netflix or whatever. But two shows that go to where I'm talking about, which may not be on people's normal repertoire. One is called Sex Education.
Indeed.
And it's for teenagers. It is very funny. My big advice is don't watch it with your teenagers. Watch it on your own or with your partner. With your children, but it is a real education in openness and kindness and humanity. So that's one, and so it's designed for teenagers to help them through the growing up piece. But it's a great thing to watch to understand what they're doing. And the other one is The Morning Show, which you have to subscribe to Apple TV to get. which goes there in a brilliant way into the dilemmas in the workplace today and the hashtag #MeToo stuff. But if you want to understand, I will take as an action to watch Squid Games. I think every man over 50 who has any form of control should be forced to watch the morning show.
Interesting. I haven't come across it. I will certainly have on my homework list to go and do that.
So your listeners wouldn't think we're talking about programs to watch.
No, it's been a fascinating discussion, Jan and Jon. Thank you so much. I know we could carry on yakking for hours, but in the interest of the sanity of our listeners, I think we'll call it a day here. It's been wonderful to hear how you came together, the importance of the issue that you're writing about, and to get some anecdotes and structures and ways of thinking from you. I mentioned at the beginning of the introduction that your book can be bought from your own website, and we'll make sure to put a link for that into the blurb that we put out with the podcast. And it just really remains then for me to thank both of you for being here and for providing such fascinating conversation.
It's been a huge pleasure, Claire. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.